Hello and welcome to another episode of Develop with WP. My name is Bobby and today we are going to do some really cool but challenging tasks. And the primary task that we're going to be assigned to do here is actually make our custom fields that we have created save actual data into the database. The problem we have right now is that while we've created these HTML elements, they don't really do anything. WordPress does not know what to do with these yet. So what we're going to do is kind of a two-part process where we're going to tell WordPress that if data exists in the database for any of these given inputs, to display that data here. And then we're also going to do the larger part, which is where we're actually going to tell WordPress when we hit update what to do with this stuff that's in these fields. So let's get started. The first thing I think we should probably talk about, though, would be the metadata, post metadata. So if we go to our database, we can see that there's a WP underscore post meta table. And this is where WordPress saves all the metadata associated with any given post. So what that means is that each one of these is going to be a piece of metadata. Each one of these fields, even this editor, it's a piece of metadata. And WordPress is going to store that in this table, and it's going to do it with a key value pair type thing, kind of like if you've worked with JSON or anything like that. You're going to have a key, in this example, job ID, and then the value that's in that field, and then the date listed, and which is the key, and then the value that's in that field. And you can see that these are for the same post, same post ID. So that's what post meta is, and that's where WordPress stores it, and that's kind of the premise for what we're doing. We are going to be working with post meta and saving stuff to the post meta table. All right, so let's get started. The first thing we need to do is pass in a variable called post. This is going to give us access to things like the post ID and whatnot, which we're going to need to do what we're going to do here. One second. I thought I was completely set up, but I was not. All right. First thing we're going to need to do is create what's called a nonce. Let me type this out real quick and then I'll explain it. Oops. All right, so let's look up WP nonce field in the codex. So while it's loading, I'll start the process. So pretty much a nonce stands for a number used once, I believe. And what it is it's when it's used for when you're submitting form data. And it's WordPress's way of ensuring that the form data that is being submitted by your form or the data that's getting submitted to the database actually came from your form and didn't come from like another source where someone's trying to essentially hack into your system and submit erroneous data to your database that didn't actually come from the form. And it's a two-part process. The first part is we define it, which we just did. And then here in a little bit, when we get to our saving function, you'll see us validate that it is correct. And if we read it, it says the nonce field is used to validate the contents of the form request came from the current site and not from somewhere else. Pretty much what I just said, but that's what a nonce is. WP nonce field is a function that that creates a nonce field that can then be checked when it comes time to save the data. All right, so that's what that is. There's actually a lot more. You really should look at some other tutorials. I'm not going to cover any more in depth than that, but the nonce stuff is really cool. You should definitely take a look at it and really become more familiar with it. But that's my basic overview. Oops. Okay, so right here, what I've done, this is the next step, is we've created a variable called DWWP stored meta, and then we're using a function called get post meta. So let's look this up because we're going to use this function right often now, and we're going to use it even more later when it comes time to when it comes time to start displaying this data on the front end. All right, so again, I told you earlier that WordPress is going to store everything in what's called post meta, and WordPress has a function called get post meta, which will actually query the database and it'll pull in data. The way this function generally works is you give it a post ID, you tell it which key, so which item you're looking for in the database, so like i.e. here job ID, that would be your key, and then you're going to say do you want it to be true or false, and this is whether or not it gets returned as a string or as an array. All right, so that's how you would use it traditionally on the front end. What we're going to do right now is slightly different. As you see, only the ID is required, and that's all we're going to pass in right now is just the post ID. And essentially what we're saying is we're telling this variable to go to the database and query all the post meta associated with this post, like just get everything. And then once we have that data, you're going to see here in our next step, we're actually going to parse through that data and pull out certain values so that we can display those values into the fields. So let's do that next. That's the next step. If you remember from the last video, we just left the value blank. And what we're going to do now is actually tell WordPress to fill this value up based on the database. So let me paste in this code because it's a lot of code, and then we'll just review it. All right, so what is happening here? We're doing two things. First, we're checking a condition. So we're saying if job ID, which is this input, so this text input is this job ID input, we're saying, you know, if this value is not empty, meaning there is a value, so let's do that again. We're just saying, is there a value in the database for job ID for this post? If there is, then we want to display that job ID value. And I'll explain this 0 right here. Essentially, I guess I'll go ahead and do it now. What happens is when this variable pulls back the data, it's going to give it to us as an array. So each one of these values, like this job ID key, is actually an array. It's not just going to be one value. And because it only has one value in the array, but because it is an array, we have to then reference it by its key within the array. And if you should know, with arrays, they start with 0. So the first value in the array would be 0. So we're saying give us the first value in the array for the key job ID. All right, that's what we're doing. And it's going to make a lot more sense here in a minute once I show you this visually. Okay, so now we told WordPress that if there is something in here to display it, let me save, actually. This might kind of be funny. Let's see. So I've been messing around with this previously, so there really is a value for this. So if I refresh, you'll see that the value shows up. And the reason that value shows up is because this database already has that value because I was messing around with this earlier. So this particular post for that job ID has this value. And because we've now told WordPress, hey, if a value exists there, show it, it's showing that value. So that's really cool. The problem with this right now is that there is no saving function. So if I were to change this, it wouldn't actually update or do anything. It would actually just disappear. Or it would actually just keep showing the same value and it would never update. Okay, so now let's do our saving function because that's the next step. All right, I'm gonna paste in a little bit of code here, and then we're just gonna talk about it because it's a lot of code, and there's no point in you watching me type it. Okay, first thing we're doing is we're setting 3 variables, and each of these variables is essentially just checking a condition. Is autosave is using a function called WP is autosave, and if you look these up in the codex, they're really self-explanatory. This one checks to see whether or not it's an autosave or whether or not it's a revision, and if it is or isn't, it's going to save that value in these variables. The next part of this is a variable I set called isValidNonce. First, what it does is it checks to make sure that when we submitted our form, which is essentially what, when you create any type of post, you're essentially submitting a form. It's saying when that form, is there a job nonce value set in that post function? And then it says, okay, now there is one, if there is one, and so if there is a nonce present and that nonce using this verify nonce matches, does it match? So it's first checking is it set and does it match? And then whether or not it does match or not will be added here. And the important thing to note here is that these need to match, these names right here need to match what you set up here, okay? So that's all this is checking. All we're doing is checking some states and saving them in a variable. Then we're saying if it is an autosave or it is a revision or the nonce is not valid. So if any of those conditions exist, just return, just exit out of the program. We don't want to do anything else. We only want this saving function to take effect when there's actually some data that needs to be updated. Then we have the last part of our function, which is one more conditional. Oops. The next thing we're going to do is say if there is data inside of that job ID input field, we want to do what's called update post meta. So before we used get post meta to retrieve the data from the database, now we're using a function called get post meta to submit data to the database, post meta to the database. And if we look that function up, you'll see that it has 3 required fields. You need the post ID, you need the key, and then you need the value. So just like when we got the metadata, we had to give it an ID, then we had to tell it which key we wanted and which value we wanted. We're doing the exact same thing, just now it's in reverse. So the first thing we're going to need to do is give it the ID, which we're going to use $post_ID. Then we're going to tell it, then we're going to tell it which key do we want to use, which is going to be job_ID. And then we're going to give it the key value. So what value? Well, where do we get the value? We get the value from the input. So, and the way we do that is we get it from what is called, from the post, when the form is submitted, post, and then within that post variable, then we'll have a job ID key value that we could access. All right, I'm just cleaning this up a little bit. But there's one more thing we actually want to do. We want to take this and wrap this in something called sanitize _text field. All right. And then lastly, we need to do an add action to kick this function off, because right now WordPress doesn't know what to do with it. And then the hook we're going to use is called save post, which is very fitting because that's exactly what we're doing. And a save. All right, so let's save this, cross our fingers, and see if it all works. All right, so now if I go in here and change this and hit update, the function I spelled sanitize text field wrong. Refresh. Let's try this one more time. It's not working. All right, let's double check our work here. So it looks like I forgot to add post underscore ID into the function, so we don't actually have access to that post ID variable that we need. So let's try that and see what happens. Let me refresh this. Let me change. Oops. Let me change that to something, and voila, it saves. All right, so let's go through here and I just want to touch on a few things. So the first thing you'll see here is sanitize text field. A lot of what I'm going to show you right now is some safety stuff or some security stuff that we're doing to make sure that our data is saved. We're following this principle of never trust anyone, even including people that are in the admin area that have access. So this sanitize text field checks for valid UTF-8, converts single characters to entities, strips all tags, removes line breaks, cleans up white space. It makes it a very clean, very safe data type. No one can pass any type of potentially harmful data into your database. The other thing we're doing is up here, you'll notice when I echo out my meta value, I'm doing something called escape attribute. And this is called always escaping latest is kind of the principle that's used here. And if you look up escape attribute, text passed through escape attribute is stripped of all invalid or special characters before output. So again, on sanitized text field, we're verifying and stripping away any data that's getting saved to the database. And then on the output with escape attribute, we're making sure that our value attribute is actually safe and doesn't have any harmful data coming out of the database. So we're checking it going in and we're checking it coming out. So those are just safety features. Along with the nonce, that's another safety feature. So there's a lot of stuff that we've done from a safety perspective to make this work. The last thing I want to show is if we go in here and do a var dump of this variable, stored meta. Why is that doing that? Stored meta. And we refresh, you'll actually see that there's a job ID and here's the value. And you'll see that it is an array, and the first value, there's only one value in the array, it is at 0, and that's why we have to put the 0 at the end of our output here. So that's how that works. I just want you to see that what that variable is. In later videos, I might show some ways to where we could change that up, but we're just going to leave it for now. All right, last thing we're going to cover. So I've showed you how to do this. It might be self-explanatory how to continue on this path of continually, just changing out and adding more inputs. But I just want to show you one more input. So I've just copied this thing above. I'm going to change out the key. What key item do we want? Then I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to create, in our save function, I'm going to create one more if statement, and it's going to have date listed. It's going to be looking for the date listed input. We'll save it. And now when we go back to our function, I think I might have left I left my var dump. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. All right, you'll see that there is already a value here because, again, I was messing around with this earlier, but if I change it in update, you'll see that it updates to that new variable. So that's what you do for every one of these inputs. You just go through and make another if statement in the saving function. You update the value. For the WP editor that we made earlier, it already has instead of a value, it has what's called $content is the content of it, and it's using the get post meta, and it's calling the principal duties key and returning it as a string. So that's already set up as well. All you'd have to do again is create one more if statement and change it to principal duties. save it, refresh, go down here and put something in here, hit update, and there you can go. It's saving our data in our editor. All right, so that's all for this video. The last thing we need to do, which is going to be the next video, the last thing we need to do is make these input fields and all this stuff just look good. So in that video, we're going to cover like how to properly enqueue scripts and styles. Then we're going to create some styles, and we're going to do a little bit of JavaScript to do some neat stuff to really make this form very interactive, very nice to look at, and very user-friendly. So again, thanks for watching this video. I know it was a long, tough video. It was kind of a complicated video, but I really appreciate those of you that stuck around to the very end. Needless to say, at the end of the day, I just hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. If you like this video, I would love a thumbs up or a share or to tweet it or let your friends know about what we're doing over here. And I look forward to interacting with you in the next couple of videos. So again, thanks and have a great day.